Welcome to the Edgelands podcast, where we keep a vigilant eye on the ever-evolving world of security technology and its impact on society and the social contract. Nairobi, a hub of innovation and progress, is embracing the digital revolution to tackle its security challenges head-on. Just like the other cities in which Edgelands is popping up, Nairobi's case serves as a microcosm of a broader global issue. The digitalization of security is a pressing topic of discussion that reverberates around the world. So whether you're an advocate for digital and security innovation or a defender of personal privacy and fairness, join us on this episode as our host, Matt, talks with Nanjira Sambuli, a Kenyan tech and governance researcher and policy analyst, in order to gain insights into the rapid digitalization of security in the city of Nairobi. Welcome.
Really big pleasure to be chatting with you and learning a little bit more about your work and the work at Edgelands in Nairobi in Kenya in East Africa. Why don't we start with just you telling who you are, introducing yourself, and what do you do in your work, but also in Edgelands?
I'm Nanjira Sambuli. I am a Kenyan researcher and policy analyst, focusing on tech and governance, and I also serve as a curator for Edgelands Nairobi project.
That's great. Can you tell me a little bit more about how what is specifically in tech you focus on?
Sure. My interests in tech have broadly been about the impact technologies as they're being introduced have on societies. So I focus a lot on the implications, gendered implications, I should say, of tech on culture, on media, entrepreneurship, diplomacy, and governance, how we govern with technologies and govern the technologies.
Great. And what does it mean to be a Edgelands curator? What's that role?
The Edgelands curator role is a fun role, first of all. It brings my knowledge of my town, my home city, into scholarship around how we're negotiating a social contract on technology's use in trying to make my city safer. And so it's first of all it's a fun role. It connects Nairobi to the global cities network, if I will. I always consider Nairobi one of those emerging cities that really is a node that helps us understand the world we're living in today, beyond the typical Western capitals around which we've been told to look to for, examples about what's happening in the world. So it's a really fortunate role to get to have to explain how what we're seeing in a city like Nairobi connects to cities like Geneva and New York and others that are typically held up as the poster children, if you will, of what's happening in society today.
Right. Yes. Anti-colonial or decolonial perspective towards these issues, which I appreciate a lot. Why don't we dive into Nairobi specifically then? And I think the themes of Edgelands are about security and safety, and that the intersection and dialogue that those themes have with technology. Mm-hmm. What are the issues and challenges that you see that Nairobi face in that regard?
Well, first of all, in relations to what Edgelands is focusing on, there's a concept of security and security in the sense of surveillance, and how that's playing out in a city like Nairobi. We are seeing a lot of movement in our city insofar as both political changes in terms of how we govern the city, which is also a capital, both administrative and commercial capital. It's a global city in the sense that we have a UN headquarters, we have a lot of INGOs, international NGOs headquarters, regional headquarters for a lot of Africa-focused or East Africa-focused entities, including in the private sector. So you have a lot of the world coming to Nairobi, and Nairobi bringing people from around Kenya to it. So it's such a node and a hotspot of diversity, of change fast and slow, that really makes for interesting dimensions around topics like technology and surveillance. In the case of trying to make the city more secure and safe, we've seen the introduction in the recent past of the same technology you've probably seen in any major city, cameras, you do further for traffic lights or for security. We've also had an unfortunate situation of having to deal with terror attacks, especially the better part of the last decade, that have increased the securitization. So one unique thing you might experience in Nairobi is any building you go into, you might have to go through a screening. That might be rare in most other cities, but for us, it's very normalized. So that just shows you how over time, as these technologies have been introduced, we've adapted to expecting that as a normal. Your car will be checked, you will be searched before you go in. And you'll actually have to write sometimes in a book with your identification number, your phone number, and sometimes even submit your national ID before accessing certain buildings. So a lot of that has become the new normal here. But the question always remains, does that make us any safer or not?
Right, and that has significant implications in the norms that we or Nairobi as a society, or the different societies that Nairobi encompass. What are the norms that are acceptable, right, to enforce security or create the sense of safety? I see. From what you explained to me, it seems that there's a recent shift, right? These norms have already been in place for a few years, a few decades, if you will. And now there's a shift of these, the implementation of these global technologies, if we can call it those, also taking a lift with this process of this norms and particular, national situation with the with security, the security norms. How do you see this new shift with the new technologies? Is it changing? Is it creating more safety because of technologies?
Well, it's certainly creating more surveillance. Everything from the black book, it's usually a black book that you will sign at a security guard's desk when you're entering a building. It could be a corporate building, it could be a government building that typically has your name, your ID number, your phone number. That little black book is really powerful in a digital economy because you have key identifiers of a person. We have the same phenomenon happening with our mobile money ecosystem, which is globally renowned, M-Pesa, where before it was digitized, the system was such that if I wanted to go and withdraw money at an agent, I would leave the same details. And we've seen that data that we typically imagine is just an exchange in that particular interaction being drawn up to different things. A few years ago, we had a bunch of us wake up one day and were registered to political parties without really having registered, because people had access to your name, your ID number, and your phone number, which are the key ingredients to actually register you to a political party. We've had a lot of data abuse as a result of that, including people stalking, especially in the case where you have to actually submit your ID. Therefore, you have to give the correct details. You can't quite obfuscate. So those norms have really become, in a sense, the way we operate in the city. And it is completely colored the conversation we have around privacy and what privacy means when these are the requirements. It's not clear that there's any law that requires us to do that, but because we have a security law that says in the event of national security, some of these measures must be taken, it has sort of created this blurred space. Now, what we're seeing with a lot of new buildings, for example, is they're even introducing more high tech, where you have to use biometrics, or a picture of you will have to be taken, and it's not clear why they have to do that, or how that data is stored, how it's used, and so on. Our data protection law is pretty recent, so therefore it's not necessarily translated to a responsibility that data controllers and data processors have, including a security guard with his little black book. So it coins a term that Bruce Schneier came up with, security theater, where you give the impression that you've set out to make people feel more secure by introducing all this stuff without necessarily doing anything to protect their security. I guess a global example will be familiar with is the liquid bans in airports, right? It's not really clear that why it was introduced. We just know after 9/11 it was. Increasingly, it's being relaxed in many places, but it's a prime example of security theater. And so for us in Nairobi, the black book, the signing into buildings, being scanned is the illusion of security theater, because that in itself has not stopped, whether it's been terrorist attacks or whether it's been theft or any other breaches of security that have happened.
That's fascinating. That's really fascinating. And you walked right into the next question, which is, how would you use this expression a lot in many Twitter spaces and public communications coming out of Nairobi? Well, how would you define tech theater?
Right. So tech theater was actually coined by a friend of mine, Sean McDonald, who was borrowing from Bruce Schneier's security theater. And he defines it as the use of tech interventions to make people feel as if a government or political leaders are doing something or solving a problem using tech without necessarily doing anything to solve the issue. So, for us in Nairobi, for example, a few years ago, traffic lights were embedded with cameras. It's supposed to be a smart monitoring system, but we still have cops on the road dictating how traffic operates, right? Especially during rush hour. So the illusion was that we have these cameras that will have the smart way of guiding traffic, but never have I known them to be operational. But it's a prime example of security theater, or tech theater for that matter. I think another example is this notion that we have in Kenya and many other countries actually around this notion of introducing identification, smart identification, whether it's digital or biometric, whatever terminology, to serve you. So the government needs to know you so that they can serve you. And to know you means they must take your iris scans or your fingerprints or any of this stuff so that they're able to offer you services. But in truth, public service is exactly about that. I should be able to show up and be served. So there's a lot of that happening, and it's couched in the language of development and high tech. That's usually supposed to give the illusion of being moving forward and solving a problem. But it's also really not actually solving the real issue, and especially when the issue is sometimes socioeconomic.
Gotta love the new technologies, right?
Oh, yeah. And the more they come out, the more there's more theater, I would say.
Yeah, but I completely understand how that, is operationalized in Nairobi from your explanation. But I wonder, challenging a little bit this impression, I wonder if you would consider theater in itself as an operational tool in order to reduce crime or create a more the sense of safety in the environment through ways that can feel, all right, I know that this place is observed because there's a camera, even though I don't know that the camera is being worked on or not. And we can't even get into the who is watching that footage or how that footage is being watched, but does it actually have no impact, or what is the impact of that tech theater in that sense? And how can we perhaps, transform that notion of theater into a more productive one that can actually address the issues of security and safety in Nairobi?
I think around the world, in many cities, it's been shown that the prevalence or increase of CCTV cameras does not necessarily lead to a reduction in crime. In that, whether people know those cameras are being watched or not, it may work for a while, but it may not work all the time. So here in Nairobi, we've had, and this will show up in the Edgelands Nairobi report, where even when people knew the streets to sort of have CCTV cameras, did not deter them from conducting crimes, whether it's like muggings on the street and others. In instances like those, it shows you that there's a limit to which this technology theater can do, because if somebody's motivated to steal because it's a dire socioeconomic situation they're in, they need to feed themselves or feed their families tomorrow, they may care less about the camera being there, or maybe even just be testing the system to be like, okay, catch me if you can. We had a recent incident again in Nairobi where there were a bunch of women walking on a street, a rather popular street, and there happened to be white ladies, and one had their bag grabbed by a bunch of young boys in a motorbike. And the government was very quick, or the county government was very quick to find them and arrest them. But it caused an uproar because ordinary Kenyans go through this all the time. But it took, what we mzungu, which is the word we have for white person, for them to act. So are you telling us it's a selective, performance around when surveillance leads to justice or to, solving the issue at hand? And those are the real challenges that show us that there's a limitation to what technology in itself can do as a stopgap, and where you need the salient policies that make sure that issues are being addressed. And where it's supposed to be about addressing crime, we have found that if especially predictive technologies are then being used in the back end, say, you have a profile of who you predict would be a typical thief, you have the situation where maybe young men in Nairobi are more likely to be picked up by the cops rather than, somebody else who's dressed in a white collar outfit. So these things show you that there's a limitation to what you can do with the technology, especially if the intrinsic motivation is warped or switches from time to time depending on the interests of the day.
And on that regard, what do you think would be from the initial insights and reports that Edgelands is putting out, what would be the direction that policymakers and politicians and youth leaders should look towards in order to create a more safe and secure city?
Well, first is to go beyond what is called tech solutionism, this idea that for every problem, tech is the answer. It's a lucrative business though. So, the moment you say, we need tech for solving crime, there's a whole procurement ecosystem that is activated, suppliers, and so on and so forth. So that drives and warps the motivations. But the real issues I think that we need to understand across the world is that for technologies to work, we need to have them in service of actually reforming, working towards, less punitive justice to more, administrative and social economic justice to ensure that people are not incentivized to actually, say, commit these crimes, whether it's petty crimes or otherwise. Technology will only serve the intrinsic motivation behind those who are deploying it. So if the right technology in the wrong hands is still going to be wrong technology, in my view. And this is a challenge of the world over. And so here in Kenya, the urgent question is even about how do we save ourselves from the dire economic and social and political situation we're in? Is technology going to serve that or not? It's kind of refreshing to be back at those, first principles, given how things have gone in a post-election phase. The euphoria of elections is over. People just want to make a living, but they want to be able to walk from place A to B and get to work. But, there are different things that are now showing people that this is beyond just deploying tech. And I kind of think that's going to be an important contribution in how the narrative around Nairobi and the social contract around technologies has been captured in the report.
That's fascinating. And you mentioned that the right technology in the wrong hands is not going to solve the problem. In that scenario, who are the right hands, or who are the right people to have the right technology?
That's a tricky one, isn't it? It's how we define right and wrong, and I don't use them to mean that they are, absolutes or false dichotomies. It ties to the fact that everything from how your government is run means you have a duty. Your civic duty becomes very activated in the sense of getting the right people with the right motivations, or more importantly, even if it's the wrong people, how can you keep them to account to use these technologies to serve the public interest rather than narrow interest and so on. And this is a challenge the world over. The rapid diffusion of technologies, and we're seeing this now, especially with the conversations around artificial intelligence, is you can have a tool that may be used for research, say to research the information environment, being used to create deep fakes that could destabilize a country, because it could be somebody takes my voice and, puts a politician's face on it and then, pushes out a narrative and destabilizes. The question about right and wrong hands becomes very tricky because these technologies are increasingly available to all of us. At the same time, we are diverse people driven by diverse interests. The only common thing we have is the social contract we have in the environments we're in. So I feel like the urgent question is, how do we make sure as more and more technologies are diffusing into the markets, how much we go back to the idea of how we negotiate, how we coexist? That, I think, is where we're able to determine who's a right player or a wrong player, because at the end of the day, if you're driven by something bigger than yourself and your narrow interests, maybe you'll act in good faith, even if you have the power to do something wrong. And so I think the more and more there's tech, the more and more we're being forced to go back to the concept of demos and how we negotiate that the world over.
In that scenario, what do you think would be the unique contribution from the Edgelands pop-up in Nairobi to achieve this or to contribute to this field?
Well, for one, the Edgelands Nairobi project has tied art and research and technology in a creative way, because I think you'll be able to see combined the different ways to see Nairobi, and especially when we're bringing this conversation to the global community. I think cities like Nairobi tend to be seen through the lens of, the capital city of a country that has poor people or something like that, but showing that we are also catching up with the recent developments, the recent technologies. I think another really important contribution is that in the world of tech, there's a lot of conversation about AI or technologies that are brought from China versus technologies that are brought from the US or the West. And here, I think the way the story is coming out is we are writ large, trying to have technologies that help us solve problems regardless of where they're coming from. And I think it will be a worthwhile contribution to show that while the rest of the world might be more fixated on geopolitical competition in technology, cities like Nairobi, countries like Kenya are trying to figure out how do they use technologies to solve for the challenges that they have in the short and long term. And I think that's an important contribution to sort of help diffuse the conversation beyond these extremes that currently exist.
Thank you so much for this chat. And I can imagine like there's so many themes that we would love to dive in, but I think our time is slowly coming up here in this first conversation. I think that, it's so interesting to have a list of all the challenges and to understand also a perspective, which doesn't seem to be like a straightforward one. It's quite complex to navigate and chat about these topics, and also to engage the appropriate people to be, as you said, to deal with the right technologies and to chat about them and to implement them in particular case of Nairobi. Anything else you'd like to add, or?
Just that folks should check out the report once published. I think it's a useful contribution to the conversations happening around technology and cities and resilient cities.
Thank you so much and have a good one.
Thank you, Matt.